Welcome everyone to another Voices with Vervaeke. The video you're about to see was originally shot on Seth Dellinger's channel. It's a discussion between myself, Seth Dellinger, and Ken Manheimer about contact improv. And it's a very powerful kind of embodiment practice that would go well in an ecology of practices in which we're trying to comprehensively cultivate wisdom. I hope you enjoy the video.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Seth Dellinger. This is the Embodied Dialogue podcast, and I'm very excited about what we have today, not only because of the two guests who are here, which I'm very excited for both of them, but because this is in fact the first time I've had two different guests, and I get to take two people who are really interesting and introduce them to each other and see what happens. So we have John Vervaeke here, and he is a professor at the University of Toronto, teaching in the departments of psychology, cognitive science, and Buddhist psychology. He's also the director of the cognitive science program, and many people know him from his work on YouTube, especially the lecture series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is how I first found out about John something like 3 years ago now, I believe it is. And also have my good friend Ken Manheimer, who's with me here in Washington, D.C. And Ken is a longtime practitioner of the practice of contact improvisation. And Ken will tell us more what that is, but he's been coordinating here in DC, along with others, a group that does contact improvisations known as the Contact Jam for nearly 20 years. He's also a computer programmer. And just to sort of make a personal connection, I mentioned that around 3 years ago, I found John's work, and this was during the pandemic. And it was sometime in that time frame too, when Ken and I started basically just going for a walk in the woods every couple of weeks. But, you know, I'm a practitioner of the Feldenkrais method. I meditate, and I've been involved in circling and a number of different practices. And something I'll be asking John about is something that John calls the ecology of practices. But one of my practices is going on walks with Ken. So to the degree that there's a connection between the two of you, often I've been walking in the woods with Ken, and I've been saying, gosh, you know, I was listening to John Vervaeke the other day, and we've been sort of sharing and trading ideas. And Ken's been someone who's just really helped me a lot in thinking through the teaching and the offerings that I do. So that's my version of the introduction, but I'd like to give you both a chance to say a little bit more about yourselves. And maybe we could start with you, John. And in addition to anything else you have to say, I would love for you to spell out a little bit about this concept of the ecology of practices and why it's so important today. And then we'll turn it over to Ken.
Thanks, Seth, and great pleasure to meet you, Ken. First, a correction. I no longer teach for the Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health program. That program has actually been shut down by the University of Toronto. So I'm just Psychology and Cog Sci now. So just a correction. So the basic idea behind ecology of practice is a way of trying to deal with two basic facts about us. Our cognition, which isn't just our knowing, it's our entire sense-making apparatus, if I can put it that way. Sweet is maybe better, is very dynamic. It's very self-organizing. It's multiple layers, recursive, very complex, a dynamical complexity. It gives us tremendous adaptivity, and at the same time, it makes us very prone to self-deception. And that self-deception can inhabit and feed off of that complex self-organization and become almost a living being within us. And intervening in that requires a counteractive dynamical system, a bunch of practices that intervene in a coordinated fashion simultaneously, or at least in parallel. And then this lines up with an independent argument that there is no panacea practice. This can be formally proved by certain things like the no free lunch theorem and the bias variance trade-off. So I won't burden anybody with those formal proofs. I'm just going to ask people to do what I have done, which is accept them as formal proofs and take that as an indication that there is no such thing as a panacea practice. There is no flawless faculty, and there is no perfect institution. And then we may despair if we still hunger for Platonic perfection, or we may take up the task of trying to make our lives have as many self-correcting systems in them as possible. This, of course, was the attempt of democracy. Um, and what that means is I'm talking about an ecology of practices. We need a dynamical systems of practices that has been put together in a fashion that gives us one of the most powerful ways of dealing with the fact that our cognition is complex, dynamical, and that it's self-deceptive, which is we can make it self-corrective by looking for complementarity relationships between practices. Find practices that have complementary strengths and weaknesses, and then they can do what's called opponent processing. They can compensate and correct for each other. A couple of easy examples is a meditative practice where you look inward, and a contemplative practice where you look outward. Practicing both of those is self-corrective. Another one is seated stillness practices, moving mindfulness practices. They need to be right. Attentional noetic practices and discursive dianoetic practices. And the list goes on and on. And so you want that complementarity, that opponent processing, self-corrective, and you also want a layering to your ecology because your cognition is dynamically layered and recursive. And you see examples of this. I mean, the one I use just because, not because it's the exhaustive or sole account, but just because the Buddhists have a habit of numbering things and laying things out in very sort of clear fashion. You have the Eightfold Path, which is represented as an eight-spoked wheel. All of these different practices are supposed to complement and contrast each other. You know that is actually what is sought after because it's not concentration and mindfulness or meditation. It's right concentration, right mindfulness, right understanding. And this is how each is being corrected by all the others. And of course, the Buddha is making use of the notion of, codependent arising, or Thich Nhat Hanh's notion of interbeing. We create this dharmic dynamical system that can counteract powerfully the parasitical processing that can take us over in comprehensive self-deception. And so the ecology of practices, that's the core argument in a nutshell. It's built off all of those ideas. And then, so there's three arguments. One about is the nature of our cognition. One is there is no panacea practice. And the third is if we look cross-historically and cross-culturally, we see religious philosophical frameworks in actually creating these rich ecologies of practices to deal with the first two truths that I mentioned. And so you have a converging of three arguments to the idea of an ecology of practices. And I use the word ecology because ecologies are these dynamic, right, things that are multi-level and they're self-organizing, they're autopoietic, and they have checks and balances throughout them so that they get into a stable, optimal grip on their environment and can persist for long periods of time and even evolve well within that environment. And that is the best that life can hope for because the perfect final form of life doesn't exist. The perfect final form of being doesn't exist. The perfect final form of practice doesn't exist, but we can get one that optimally evolves its optimal grip on the world. That's as best I could do.
Lovely.
That's pretty good. Thank you, John. And what I'm hoping we can do is explore the practice of contact improvisation and also look at it within the framework of the ecology of practices. And I know you'll have more to say about this, John, but also, why do we need, in particular today, an ecology of practices?
Yeah.
And, what are some of the dynamics of contact improvisation that could contribute to this? So Ken, please introduce yourself and share a little bit more about contact improvisation.
Well, I want to bookmark a couple of things to remind myself from what John said. I have the sense I want to tell my story in a way to relate it to what John was saying, because I think I have done some of that counterbalancing that you were talking about, John, in pursuing. I come from a family that is highly verbal and interested in technical kind of thoroughness stuff, and so when programming, which was not so prevalent when I was young, was around, I really was drawn to it and took it up. I like programming a lot, and I still do. I also feel like I have a sort of love-hate relationship with words. There's a lot that you can do with words and that I want to do with words, and sometimes that works out as I hope, and sometimes it doesn't, and I struggle with that. And so all this is to say that I also really liked moving and being in my body, being physical. And I'm very happy that in college I found my, I was taking a biology of movement, of exercise section in a biology course. And I spoke with a teacher about a project, and she said that she was teaching a class in contact improv in town. And I might be interested in it. And so that's how I was introduced. And as soon as I saw it and got a feel for it, I knew it was something I would like to do and have done since. This is college in 1979. So for the most part, I've been doing it fairly regularly as a folk practice, as something that we gather to do this thing that I'll talk more about. But to get back to this counterbalancing, I feel that particularly because of the way contact improv approaches it, it's very much not an explanatory thing. It's an experiential thing. And it's an experiential thing that you do in a kind of deep way with someone else where neither person is leading, neither person is in control. Ideally, you're both following. And of course, there's all sorts of layers and layers of where we fool ourselves and go to habits and go to ways that take us off the present moment. But it's a practice of being in the present moment with someone else, and I'll say more about that when we get to it. But my experience over the years, as I've gotten familiar and comfortable with it, is that there's a kind of language in it that I get to carry on with other people that is not burdened with a lot of the complications of spoken language with other people. And so I'm very thankful I have spoken language, and I'm very thankful that I have this way to connect and communicate with other people. And in some ways it feels more like a native language for me, my first tongue. And that may have created a mystery of what contact improv is. We can get to that in a moment. But another thing I wanted to say, something that I was taught early on by my father, who kind of disabused me of the notion that we know anything absolutely as a kind of playful exercise. But it's spurred in me this curiosity about what it means to have a sense of what's real. And I think as you were speaking about ecology of practices and how we fool ourselves, also as a programmer, this comes up a lot. You know, it's very tempting to blame the compiler for the errors, and you discover again and again and again how you can mislead yourself in debugging. And so finding out, noticing what's real and what is really going on with myself, with the world, with others, I think in programming and in contact improv and in conversation and in meditation and in all these things is what I see as the thing you were talking about in a little bit different light. And the last note I want to make is that, particularly learned from contact improv, is that in order to notice what what's real. I think the most fundamental thing is learning to participate, to be
Yes.
part of.
Yeah. Wow, that's really rich. I mean, that notion of participation being that you're knowing not by representing or applying even a skill, you're knowing by you and something else sharing the same principles, right? Being bound within the same process, mutually shaping each other, being shaped mutually shaped by the process you're both within. That participatory knowing, I think, is the deepest grounding kind of knowing that makes all the other kinds of knowing possible. I think the coordination, I think each knowing has a sense of realness to it. That participatory knowing is that sense of like belongingness, rightness with the world
Right,
kind of
belonging.
sense. Uh, that the perspectival knowing, the knowing that comes through noticing and what we're foregrounding and backgrounding and noticing how we might be messing it up and therefore needing insight. That perspectival knowing, I think it gives it something else. I think that's running through what you said. The sense of real there is that sense of presence, that sense of somebody being sort of fully actualized in contact with the situation. And then for skills, it's our power. And then finally, for our beliefs, it's truth. And I think we have fixated too much on propositional truth. And we've lost the other kind of truths, what it is to be true to someone and for your aim to be true and to be betrothed and all that. And so what you just said, I heard all of that echoing through everything you said. So deep
Yes, thank
resonance
you.
for me. I have one question, just to draw you out a little bit more. You said something really provocative about that counterbalancing, which I really appreciated. You talked about spoken language, and then you talk about a realization of, and this was your metaphor, a language of sort of improv and contact. And I found, and of course, there's an interesting thing there. You're obviously trying to use that metaphorically because you're making a contrast between spoken language and this other. Um, and I mean, and this puts me to the idea of the Greek, the ancient Greek idea of the logos as something that is not just found in language or logic, but in any way in which things gather together to make sense. We do a practice called dialectic into dialogos, where we try to get that being present in addition to the spoken language.
Hmm.
And a question has emerged for me in there, and I've been exploring it in some of the online courses I've been teaching. And I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to hear your thoughts, because I already have a sense you're wise, and I want to know. And I'm not going to do the Socratic thing with you. I'm not trying to draw you out or anything like that. I'm trying to deduce like how do those two, and I'm going to play with the metaphor. Do those two, the spoken language, and let's call it the language of contact movement, um, do they talk to each other for you?
There are several layers. First of all, thank you for. Um, I was very excited about this opportunity to talk with you and Seth
Yeah,
because I can see the relationships, the salient things that overlap. I
yeah.
believe there's a lot to share here. Um, the I think of a couple of responses to your question.
Right.
One has to do with um, with a question people often ask when they're learning to do improv of any sort, but contact improv is the one I'm most familiar with, or movement improv, which is how do I stop my mind from working or get my mind out of the way?
Hmm.
And my response is not to get your mind out of the way, but to find a way for me to find a way to um, to let my mind, the kind of spoken or executive mind, do what it does well, which is planning and recognizing opportunities and doing things that reflex doesn't do as well, or the more immediate responses.
Mm.
And then to also give reflex and more intuitive sense of where things are going and being present in the moment to have a cooperation, a collaboration between these different skills.
Right, right, right.
And the thing I hear in your in the crisis you're talking about is where we let some skills try and do the job of other
Yes.
skills.
Yeah, yeah. And I think more than skills, I think that's right. I think we try to let modes of being, roles, identities, try to do the jobs for others.
Right.
Uh, right.
Right. I so much agree. And yeah, yeah,
So,
the right. Go ahead.
yeah, Ken, I want to zero in on that because um, um, I, this is like so for me. This getting the noetic, the nonverbal, and the dianoetic, the discursive to, as you said, to collaborate and cooperate. I think this is actually the key to avoiding nihilism. I think if you just do one or the, oh, if you just do
I
this, you get
totally
empty
agree.
chatter. If you do
Right.
this, you get this sort of silence that can be terrorizing to people, right? And doesn't connect with our endeavors to make sense of the world. And so. I, you've been doing this a long time, and what's the phenomenology of when they're collaborating? So I imagine you have a sense of when they're not collaborating and a sense of when they are. And what's that shift like? I'm sorry, we have this useless word in English. What does it feel like? I'm trying to get more than what does it feel like?
Right.
What's the phenomenology when it shifts from not collaborating to collaborating? How does that how are you realizing that? How does that
So
come to you?
so I think I need to back up a little bit because
Yeah.
um, I said there were two things that occur to me, and one is a little different, but I think it relates. I think it's an
Okay,
important
please.
piece of this. The One of the big lessons, one of the most fundamental skills I've found in improvising that is a little different than the kind of virtuosity that people often recognize and aim for is when collaborating, it's easy to get diverted by paying attention to the person you're collaborating with at the exclusion of paying attention to yourself,
Uh-huh.
or
Uh-huh.
paying attention to yourself and
Right.
not giving opportunity to receive them. And the greatest skill and the greatest difficulty, but the challenge that's also the most exciting when I'm actually doing it, is to be able to have room for both, to listen to myself and listen to the person or people or the situation I'm communicating with.
Mm.
And so in response to your last question about where that shift is or how it works, when it's the same thing with the verbal and nonverbal, I think. When I'm
Mm.
able to leave space for the verbal, one funny thing is the psychology 101 or the excuse of I don't have words to talk about this thing, that sometimes that talking about art can be useful, but
Yeah.
useful to a limit. You want to use it in the ways that it's helpful, where it shines light, and
Right.
and recognize some places where it doesn't.
Hmm. Hmm.
So finding that balance, I guess, which is sounds a little trivial, but it's
No, it doesn't. It sounds
essential.
exactly the opposite to me. It sounds like the thing that we're talking about at the core of dialogos, when you're getting exactly that almost stereoscopic awareness, and it's resonating.
That's right.
Um,
We're able to
I,
bring these multiple capacities to bear.
that's
And
fantastic. Go ahead, Seth. My question has been answered very well.
yeah, and it's wonderful just to actually mostly be a bystander here and watch the two of you. I just wanted to mention, and I'll let you decide, Ken, when's an appropriate moment. But I also just have a small amount of video clips so that John could, you were asking what it feels like, but also to see what it looks like. And we have two different clips, one which is more on the sort of virtuosic end of things, and one is much more simple. But if this is a good time, I could play it now, Ken.
Maybe I'd like to first describe in a
Perfect. Yeah.
sort of
So just let me
Please.
know. And
skeletal way.
yeah.
Yeah. So there's so much I want to say, but contact improv came out of postmodern dance, a group of people, including a pretty highly trained dancer and martial artist, did Aikido and so forth. Steve Paxton was part of Merce Cunningham's company and studied with various other people, worked at a high level in dance, but also formed a group and found a studio space at a place called Judson Church in Greenwich Village, and experimented with all sorts of alternative things, including that what is dance? What is it? What's the difference between pedestrian movement and dance? And can they overlap? What's the boundaries? And in playing with that, exploring and experimenting, Steve came up with a famous at a winter term course at Oberlin that he just had men enrolled, where they explored colliding and sort of physical kinetic rebounding energy with each other, and also the opposite of that, sort of standing still and finding things in between, and was excited, found something to play with. And what developed out of that, which is different than the original, there's a video called Magnesium that you can find, I think, on YouTube, of the performance they did. The framing of the practice that I have, it's fairly elemental, is people mutually following shared points of contact. Mm. And the trick, the challenge, is to be following rather than feeling like you have to make stuff happen. You have to do stuff to and in fact, Seth, it might be better to lead with the finger dance video.
Sure.
To show, so this will show the very, very simple, if you touch fingers together, and there's actually a lead-in, a way to tune into it that is helpful for this exercise, that it goes somewhere. So this is, I wouldn't normally talk while leading this, and I'm trying as a leader to not lead when doing this. We're both still and trying to follow each other's finger movement, and of course there's a feedback loop. It's like the Ouija board, where the challenge, of course, is that when people play Ouija boards, they want to go to the certain letters to spell things out. But if they can refrain from doing that, then and really listen, the small movements. Steve Paxton actually pays a lot of attention to a thing he calls the small dance. There's movements going on, and if you're willing to be patient and respect the refraining from making stuff happen, you can tune into that, and there's material to play with, a faltering or a shake, and that gets amplified by one person following the other, following the other, following the other, and it's not arbitrary, but and in the way you follow, you can make choices about whether you follow quick or slow or big or small. And those choices start to represent you in the collaboration.
So I'll actually just jump in here a moment to say that whenever it is that I showed up at my first contact improvisation event, and Ken was there and there were others, and I had my own background in other movement forms, and I have background in musical improvisation, so I thought, okay, I just get to move my body every which way, and I must have been flipping out and doing crazy things. And at a certain point, Ken was like, "Hey, you're new. And he showed me the finger dance. And Ken often does this to introduce people to the concept of contact improvisation, because, of course, you can see with the fingertip, it's very minimal. But just to give a little bit of my own experience with it, you touch fingers and you close your eyes, and right away it feels like, oh, that person's pushing my finger around. But then at a certain moment, you go somewhere and you say, I want to go over here. And then you realize, oh, I'm pushing them. And then you have to sort of, so like the practice, it's yet another kind of a presence practice, but it's this interpersonal one. And then there can be a moment where, let's say it's Ken and I are both doing this, and we really do have a sense that neither one of us is leading. But of course, anyone watching sees our fingers going here and there, and it eventually the practice can involve the whole body. And I also just want to mention, because the video clip that we played, that's where Ken and I go walking and where the musicality of being workshops happen, which is maybe another thing that we don't have to get into a lot, but it's sort of a place where Ken and I are bridging some of what he does and some of the practices you do, John, because there's a relational, we're walking down the trails and talking and whatnot. But just to sort of underline that distills something, that and
it distills something, and it also, in a way, it's not sufficient, because doing that with multiple points on your whole body it adds another element, which is, for one thing, being in another person's personal space, but also finding ways to engage so that you're staying engaged. You're going along with each other, going through all the pragmatics of moving through space together. And so one of the sort of the complementary exercise that I often do is this notion of counterbalancing, a slight counterbalance, where you're sharing your balance with someone else. And that's a magical thing. It's something that takes a while to get a feel for it. Some people get it quickly. Some people take a while. And one of the big parts of the dynamic of contact improv jams, where people gather to practice, is that each person you practice with has a different idea about what we're doing. And so practicing with different people, and over time, you start to get a sense of some kind of common ground, some kind of feel that enables you to engage with someone who you actually don't speak the same language. This is done around the world, and people often remark on going to Japan or Korea or Britain or wherever, and having this opportunity to dance with, to have this conversation, this movement conversation with someone with whom they don't share verbal language.
so maybe I'll just play the other clip here, or did you want to say something first, John?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I did. I just wanted to, I have done this practice multiple times, but I thought it was very valuable to just have you first describe it and show the videos. I've done it at sort of three different, I did it at Return to the Source with Rafe Kelly, and especially with some of the instructors there. I did it at both of the Respond meetings, the one that was in Vermont and the one that was in Bergerac, and quite a few variations on it. And then there's similar things also within Tai Chi Chuan, push hands and sticky hands and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm not claiming proficiency. What I'm saying is you can assume I have a little bit of the phenomenology if you want to talk a little bit more deeply about it. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I think there's layers and layers, and one of the really beguiling things for me is this question of what virtuosity means in any practice, but in this practice in particular.
Right.
And it's I think the virtuosity I mentioned of being able to listen to yourself and listen to someone else, and not have it be so much about what you're doing, but about doing together, is the ultimate for me.
Mm.
But what we'll see in this video is people who have developed a lot of ability to engage with each other and to take it into moving through three space, through spherical space, as they call it, pretty far and wide, and with a lot of alacrity. And it's a joy. And yet I want to put in a caveat that in order, actually, I feel that in order to get to that depth of and intensity of collaboration, trying to do the things doesn't work.
Yeah, this is the trying to try paradox, right? That Ed Schlingerland talks about so much, right? Exactly. But I'd like to see the next clip, please.
Great. There we are. So I
Yeah,
think
yes,
yeah, go ahead.
I've done this version of the practice a couple times. This where it gets into this very, I don't know what to say, almost gymnastic
Right.
kind of movement. Uh,
Right. And yeah, the thing I would point out is that what people see is from a regular frame of reference when people are getting rides is lifting, and what I see and what I want to suggest is riding,
yeah,
is
yeah,
you're following trajectories and taking the opportunity when someone is moving in a way to take that little ride she got on his hip right then. That there's a big degree of going where you're going, and yet being able to alter where you're going to take an opportunity to get a ride and give a ride. And then ultimately, you're getting and giving rides so continuously that it's not clear who's doing what at each moment.
yeah. There was two things that I noticed, and I might be misrepresenting things, but I noticed that sort of phenomenon of bleed, where I couldn't tell where things
Mhm.
were originating from. And then that other one that you sort of made an allusion to with the Ouija board, there was like there's a spirit, and I'm just participating in sort of keeping it alive rather than trying to make the movements happen. And I don't know if that tracks, but
No,
that's
very much.
okay.
It's I believe that the when you're both tuned in, you have this there. So there's one of the original people who worked with Steve Paxton after his performance. It's a woman named Nancy Stark Smith, who actually died during the quarantine in
Oh, sorry.
2022. Yeah, a lot of us are. Um, she was sort of the torchbearer for contact improv for a while, and she developed this out of her teaching, and particularly teaching skills. She noticed that she was losing some taste, some affinity for the teaching of skills, but her students noticed that there was some preparation she was doing for to get people ready if they were doing what she called low, slow flow, things that involve moving close to the ground, or then the higher energy, taking a ride up through space on somebody's shoulder or hip. That she would prepare them for these things, and those preparations became she came to realize were as important or more than the specific skills she was focusing on.
Right, right, right.
So the glue between things, the way that we connect together and we participate, we organize ourselves to participate, is as important as anything else. She developed a practice out of that, a thing called an underscore, which has a description in it, and the description is full of words and full of these layers of things that happen, a kind of progression. But the progression is just to prepare just to make
Yeah.
suggestions about how to participate, as opposed
Yeah.
to what to do when you're participating.
The whole of the when you're playing Tai Chi, the whole of the form is just preparation for letting go of the form, which doesn't mean you stop doing the form. Right. Yeah. And so um, there's something of deep philosophical interest, and I mean philosophy as a way of life, cultivation of wisdom, not academic philosophy here, because for me, this I talk a lot about transjectivity, neither subjectivity or objectivity, but the deeper thing that binds the inner and the outer together. Lerman talks about the three senses of real, and we have been so fascinated since Descartes with the subjective and the objective, and we've lost the third sense of real. We've lost the sense, the transjective sense, even though at some level it has to be there operating unconsciously, or we'd be just trapped within our minds, or just dissipated into the world. Um, and do people do people like report that an awakening of that sense after doing this practice for some time? And does that transfer? Oh, great. So you're nodding vigorously. That's great, Ken. So, and does that transfer broadly and deeply into their life and transform at multiple levels of their psyche? For me, these are the criteria I look for when and I use this term as a compliment, not as a pejorative. When I'm looking for a ritual, I'm looking, does it transfer broadly and deeply into many domains of people's lives? And does it transform broadly and deeply many levels of the psyche? And so does that happen? Do they get this sense, this third realness, and does it do that transfer and that transformation? Do people report that?
Yes, and I take it from what they say that it relates to my experience of it, which
Right.
is very much the sense. So I said that I had disappointments with words earlier on, and I think
Yeah.
they're sort of my own quirks, my struggles have to do with difficulty finding ways to keep my enthusiasm for
Mm,
where my thoughts are going from doing that thing of following myself and no longer paying attention to that I'm being followed.
right. Right.
And so this whole question of learning to participate and learning to participate in a way where I feel like I'm part of what's going on, as opposed to, and it happens in this conversation. We're doing that now in
Yeah.
any conversation, in any relating.
Yeah.
And the trick is, it's not entirely clear to me how to ensure that I'm going to get to share the points I want to share with you. But I think this point, actually, this notion of participating in what you're describing, of the third, being in that third part, the one where it's neither you nor someone else, but together, uh, is the juiciest thing. It's just yeah.
Well, because I think that connectedness described that way. And I wanted to do the description first, because when people hear connection, they're doing the standard two things and the relation between them. And that's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about this, not that, right? This fundamental relationality, not a relation between two relata, but this more fundamental relationality. I think that religio, that connectedness and that sense of it, and the sense of it impregnating your life and percolating through your psyche, is exactly what has been threatened by the meaning crisis in modernity. And so in many ways, this is what I mean when I say the answer to this problem of the meaning crisis and nihilism is not an argument. It's learning how to fall in love with being again.
Yeah.
And so does that land for you, what I just proposed, that
Right.
this is why
So
people are hungry for this?
right, and I can only sort of relate from my personal experience.
Of course.
My experience is that contact improv is ridiculously important to me because it gives me an avenue to play with people and in a way that is so immediate and thorough, both immediate and thorough, that
Mm,
that it's um, that it bridges. It also there's a number of things that it isn't. You know, um, it's not likes. It's not. In fact, people do it to as performance, but
mhm.
it's really very participatory.
Yeah, yeah,
And the you don't have to do fancy stuff to be extremely engaged.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And you don't
yeah.
need a lot of equipment. You don't have to. It's not commerce. It's not. It's not even sort of. Um, our lives are not getting entangled or not getting extremely involved in doing this.
Thank you for watching. This YouTube and podcast series is by the Vervaeke Foundation, which, in addition to supporting my work, also offers courses, practices, workshops, and other projects dedicated to responding to the meaning crisis. If you would like to support this work, please consider joining our Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes. Well, that brings me up a question. May I ask it, or did you want to
Yes.
make
No.
another
No.
point?
Yeah.
So and we talked earlier about confusions, and one of the things that, and because I remember when I did this practice, I was confronting this, right? So when we teach people dialectic and dialogos or philosophical contemplation, people will often say, "Oh, I discovered a form of intimacy I didn't know existed, but I'm always been looking for."
Right.
Right? Right. But one of the problems, and I even felt it in myself, and and I've been a Tai Chi player for like 3 decades, and a meditator and a contemplator. But nevertheless, when I was doing these practices, it's like my brain was going the standard models of intimacy. Oh, this is familial? Nope. Right? Oh, this is sexual? Nope, nope, nope. Right? And my brain was trying the usual scripts of what intimacy is and what intimacy means. And I had to. It's almost like with the way you label a distraction and you return to your breath. I had to keep sort of labeling those and then trying to return to this sui generis kind of intimacy. And I'm wondering, like maybe that's idiosyncratic, or do people do they go through a period where they're wrestling with that, or does that come back at certain times?
Yes. So I have a way to describe this that I've been working on.
Okay.
What this difference is, and the
Oh,
a phrase I've come up with that I find really useful is shared agency, but a more
right. Yeah.
a simple thing that relates to shared agency, that we're doing something together. And in a lot of things, a lot of games are arranged so we can do something together, but what we're doing together is very constrained. It's some
Mhm.
kind of pattern where we're knocking a ball and forth across a table playing ping pong, or where we're going in 4/4 time doing these steps. It's arranged so that we can be in this very restricted kind of space, but doing it together. That's great. But actually steering together, actually making choices and taking it so that we could. It's sort of the difference between driving on in a city on the streets, and or going out into the wilderness where we're walking together and we're getting to pick any direction. As we get more comfortable with the choices we each make, we can then start making choices about not just staying on the path, but making a new path or climbing a tree or whatever. That's so. So I believe that a lot of games trade off freedom for structure, and
Right.
that structure organizes us together. The contact improv, instead of using patterns, does this simple task of following the contact points, and that alleviates the structure. There's a lot of freedom, but then the freedom is you have to be willing to deal with the pragmatics of moving together and learn to do that. And then it's not arbitrary. You're not just caressing each other. You're actually moving together. So the intimacy that people talk about, which there's a movement called touch and play which explores that as a this sort of contact improv-y, but playing with that as a framework to explore physical intimacy. But this is not what contact improv is per se. Contact improv is about exploring moving together. And there's a lot of layers to that, a lot of territory to explore that involves the discovering how immediately and thoroughly you can be making choices together.
There's something.
Yeah,
Oh, just quickly, John, you've
please.
talked about in Dialectic into Dialogos that something we can do that is falling outside of the practice is we begin to project on the other person, right? And we have various ideas. There was a visiting teacher of contact improvisation who came to Washington, D.C. I think she's come a couple times, but a workshop I attended last year where she was dancing with someone and demonstrating. And then she sort of said, here's me demonstrating an idea. And she sort of threw herself on the other person without much, like care and that kind of thing. And then she moved in and out, but it was really, even though she spoke and used her words to demonstrate, you could see when she was in this place that is more maybe what you would call a transjective relation, and when she was a person doing a thing or trying to get a thing from the other dancer. And so this, what you were asking about before, there are kind of like very clear pitfalls in this practice that one runs into, but then working your way through it. And when it feels like you've reached that place, like the phenomenology of it can be that it's just effortless. Like I've had the experience of being lifted and I almost don't know how it happened. I'm just suddenly up in the air and these things. So you can get a sense of a kind of a joined mind or a joined, I love that phrase, shared agency. Ken, so I just wanted to bring that in.
And there's three things I want to say in response to that. So Dan Chiappia and I have published a bunch of papers, 3 papers actually, in high impact cog sci journals about shared agency, we agency, and what that looks like. And then in Dialectic into Dialogos, we talk about the particular kind of agency that you get in the flow state. We talk about the shared flow state because the interesting thing about flow is it sort of demonstrates to you the lie that the narrative ego is the author of your agency, and you could put that aside and have your agency enhanced, even though you're not being driven from your narrative ego. And I think that seems to be showing up. Well, it does for me. You get into something like the flow state.
So Nancy,
and then just one more point, Ken.
Yeah,
and then maybe,
and I'll bookmark what I was going to say.
Yep. Thank you. And then the other one is, and this follows from the first two, which is James Carse, who unfortunately we lost, talks about infinite games as opposed to finite games. And I think what I heard you saying that there's a lot of things we do together, but we're playing finite games in which, there's a set of rules. I think you called it a pattern, and we all commit to those rules, and then we move around within that. And then, and we try to say to people that Dialectic into Dialogos is not a finite game, it's an infinite game. Because in an infinite game, you can actually, part of the game is changing the rules of the game.
Right, you're playing to continue the play, and as the play changes, you need to change the rules.
Exactly. And so there's no deeper point. Those are 3 things that came to mind as you were speaking, and I just wanted to put them into the shared space between us.
So it reminds me of a thing I was going to say. First of all, I almost want to catch my breath because I said earlier that there were things I would have wanted to have discussed here, and I'm feeling like they're just happening. I'm so happy to be getting to the things that are important about this for me. The thing I was going to say about Nancy Stark Smith and her underscore is that there's a discussion, there's a little part of the talk through that talks about these phenomena, these things that occur in collaborative improv, particularly in contact improv, but in any kind of collaborative improv. And one of them is this thing she calls streaming, which is when you're in a situation, when you're in a state where the way I think of it is you don't have to add a lot of effort in order to keep going because you're part of it. It's carrying you in a way, and you're carrying it. So that's streaming. And part of the reason I mentioned is because there's another one that I think is, I just love the description she came up with of the score as a whole. There's this thing called the gap, which is symbolized by a pair of square brackets with an empty space in the middle. The empty space is any time where you feel you lack a frame of reference, which can be disconcerting, but it can also be an opportunity to discover new things. It's that pregnant moment of intuition. And these are both part of the phenomenology that in order to have the richness of being carried by what you're doing, you also, if you're really continuing to be spontaneous and exploring what's happening, you have to be faced with moments where you're not sure where you belong or what fits.
And that's part of the lesson of these practices, is to remind ourselves that that actually fundamentally is our true state. We fall into this presumptive pretense of certainty, and the areas of reality and cognition where I think certainty is actually possible are very, very small, very, very small. I wonder, did she get that phrase? I mean, I'm not accusing her of plagiarism by any means, but in Buddhism, there's the idea of entering the stream, where you get exactly that phenomena you're describing.
I believe so. She was a Buddhist. And
so there you go. There you go. Right. So that makes sense.
And it's also out of her practice. Yeah, the notion that we know what thinking is, I think, is pretty misguided, and that what we're able to identify as thinking is a very, very small portion of it.
Yeah, part of my work as a cognitive scientist, and it's continually inspired and empowered by these kinds of practices, is to open up even the meaning of our accepted terms. What does it mean to be rational? What does it, like, I think there's a deep rationality in what we're talking about that has nothing to do with the logical manipulation of propositions.
Right.
It has to do with overcoming profound kinds of automatic self-deception in a very comprehensive and powerful way, which I think is ultimately the most important goal. Well, there's two. There's overcoming that self-deception. The other is enhancing the connectedness, the religio. And I think I think that our modern Cartesian notion of rationality has lost those as being the central thing we're pointing to when we ratio, logos. It didn't mean the exclusion of these things. In fact, it ultimately pointed to them as being crucial. So, I've been constantly trying to expand both the vocabulary that we're using to talk about the mind and its relationship to body and each other and the world, and also to reinvigorate, enrich, expand the referent of even our established and existing terms, precisely because of what we're talking about. I think the presumption that we have a sufficient grasp such that we can just proceed, I think that needs to be radically challenged, because for the most part, it is changing now, but for the most part, we have a model of mind that is driving people into the meaning crisis rather than helping them awaken from it. And I think that is a deep critique of both the moral status and the explanatory adequacy of our current models of the mind.
John, there's something that you've mentioned recently that I just want to bring in, and I hate to notice the time, but we're also close to the end of our time. So maybe just have an opportunity for each of you to say a final word. But there's something you've mentioned recently in reference to different kinds of ecology practices, but I believe it's something you're developing with dialectic into dialogos. And in relation to the meaning crisis and the many crises within it, it's like people are going to have to come together and collaborate. And so you talk about the need for people to find a way of being involved with the whole self, but not self-involved.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a little piece. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, and then any other final thoughts you have before we end.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you. That's an excellent reminder. Yeah, this is, I call that Plato's pivot problem, what actually turns people, because And this sort of became very pronounced to me when I was at Bergerac last summer with a bunch of people who are all leaders of emerging and um, I think very legitimate and healthy ecologies or practices, communities around the world. And these people, I like admire them. But in the middle, we were doing a group practice, and it came to me as something pronounced that I wanted to share with the group, and they all picked it up. So that's not praising me. There's merit to the proposal, right? Which is this idea of, and Plato really wrestled with it. How do you involve the whole of the self without becoming self-involved? And this is like the opposite. These are two sides of the same coin. This is the opposite, but identical with Slingerland's trying not to try problem, and these two have to do with what ultimately, like if there's no moving, this is Plato's problem. If there's no movement of the good within someone, there's nothing you can do to move them to the good. But how do people then move to the good if they don't know the good and all of that problem? But this is exactly it. How do we try not to try? How do we involve the whole of the self without becoming self-involved? And part of the answer is, and I think he finally comes to it in the seventh letter. Part of the answer is, well, it isn't something that you or I or even we do. It's something we use the metaphor from Heraclitus of a fire, and what we do is we put the logs together. But the spark, if we try to make the fire, as opposed to set up the conditions by which the fire will take shape, then we have not understood what fire is. And in the same way, you can't make the logos, but you see it just like it's not objective or subjective. It's neither action nor passion. It's not where passion means passivity, the ancient sense of passion, right? It's this other. It's participation, like you said, Ken, and there's something about a sacredness in participation that seems to be what has the capacity to turn people. And that's very nebulous, I know, but that's where my thinking is right now. And it seems to me we're bumping up against this in this practice in a profound way. So that'll be the last thing I say.
Well, and so can I respond? Just a
Please.
thought that's going through my head is that attachment to knowledge can prevent discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And that discovery, Einstein was apparently misquoted, but was of the sentiment that that rationality was the servant of intuition, and we have come to mistake the servant for the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that practices, opportunities for people to practice discovery together as opposed to demonstrating their knowledge is something that we need. And ideally, it's kinds of practices that are substantial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Wow.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
a pleasure just to introduce the two of you, because I had a feeling sparks would fly, and so it might be wonderful to do this again sometime. I'm sure we could have kept going, but I just want to thank you both so much, for taking this up today. And yeah, it felt good to me just to see this connection, because John, I've been practicing with Ken all the time since I've known your work. And as I mentioned, kind of riffing when we go on walks together about these things. So it's good to actually have the two of you to connect today.
Yeah, this was wonderful. This became dialogos and not just discussion. And for me, Socrates says it best. That is the best way for human beings to live, when we can. And it doesn't always have to be spoken dialogos, exactly. But whenever we're in dialogos, this is the optimal form of human existence. And we got into it, and I want to thank you both. Thank you.
It's an honor. Thank you.